I realized my son had erased me the moment my hotel key stopped working. I stood there in the middle of the marble lobby, staring at the small blinking red light on the door panel like it had just pronounced a sentence I didn't understand yet. Just an hour earlier, I had been in that room, carefully folding my clothes, setting aside the silk scarf I'd bought as a gift for Vanessa, thinking about how lucky I was to finally be here. Dubai had always felt like a distant dream to me, the kind of place you only saw in magazines or travel shows, all glass towers and golden light. And yet there I was, a 68-year-old widow from Ohio, standing inside one of the most luxurious hotels I had ever seen, invited by my own son as a thank you for everything I had done for him. At least, that's what he had said. I pressed the key card again. Read. A quiet, final rejection. I checked my purse, my fingers moving faster now, searching for my wallet, my phone charger, anything that made sense. The lining felt wrong. Too light. Too empty. My wallet was gone. My passport wasn't where I had placed it that morning. Even the small envelope of emergency cash I always carried was missing. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand still inside the purse, as if I might find everything if I looked one more time. The hallway was silent, thick carpet swallowing every sound, the air cool and controlled. It felt like the building itself was pretending nothing had happened. I stepped back from the door slowly and looked down at the card again, as if it might suddenly change its mind. It didn't. I turned toward the elevators, my reflection catching in the polished metal doors. My silver hair was still perfectly in place, my navy blouse neatly pressed, my posture straight out of habit. I didn't look like someone who had just been locked out of her own room. I looked like someone waiting. That was the worst part. Nothing about me showed what was actually happening. The ride down to the lobby felt longer than it should have. When the doors opened, the world came rushing back in. Voices, soft music, the faint scent of expensive perfume. People moved around me in effortless confidence, laughing, checking in, ordering drinks. No one noticed the woman who had nowhere to go. I walked toward the front desk, each step steady, measured, the way I had trained myself to walk through difficult moments my entire life. I had always believed that if you stayed calm, if you remained composed, things would sort themselves out. That belief had carried me through raising Ryan on my own after his father passed, through working double shifts, through years of putting someone else first. But as I approached the counter, I saw him. Ryan was standing just a few feet away, his back partially turned, speaking quietly with Vanessa. She looked polished as always, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her hand resting lightly on his arm as she spoke. He didn't look surprised to see me. He didn't look guilty. He just looked finished. Like whatever role I had played in his life had already ended, and I was the only one who hadn't gotten the memo. I stopped a few steps away, close enough to hear the tail end of his sentence. "It's already been handled," he said, his voice calm, almost bored. Vanessa nodded, her lips curving into a small, satisfied smile. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not shattered, not exploded, just settled. Like a truth I had been circling for years had finally landed. I glanced down at my empty hands, then back at my son, and for the first time, I understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision, and I was no longer part of it. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known as I stood there trying to hold on to what little dignity I had left, was that across the lobby, someone had been watching me from the moment my key card failed, and he knew exactly who I was. I did not say anything to Ryan in that moment, because there are silences in life that speak louder than questions, and I had learned long ago that asking someone why they are hurting you rarely brings the answer you hope for. Instead, I turned away from him and walked toward a quiet corner of the lobby where a row of low chairs faced a wall of glass overlooking the city, and I sat down carefully as if nothing unusual had happened, as if I were simply resting after a long day of sightseeing. The city stretched out beneath the late afternoon sun, all shimmering towers and endless motion, and for a few seconds I let myself focus on that view because it was easier than looking inward at what I already knew was true. Just 2 days earlier, I had stepped off a 14-hour flight with a small carry-on bag and a heart full of something I had not felt in years, something dangerously close to hope. Ryan had met me at the airport himself, which surprised me because he had not done that since he was a teenager picking me up after one of my late shifts. He had smiled, hugged me briefly, and said, "Welcome to Dubai, Mom." in a tone that sounded practiced but warm enough to convince me not to question it. Vanessa had been waiting in the car, elegant as always, her voice sweet but measured as she complimented my travel outfit and told me how excited they were to show me the city. I remember looking out the window as we drove past buildings that looked like they belonged in the future, thinking that maybe, just maybe, this trip meant something had changed between us. For years, our conversations had been short and polite, reduced to holiday calls and occasional updates about his work, always initiated by me, always ending before I had a chance to say anything real. When he called a month ago and insisted on flying me out, covering everything, telling me I deserved a break, I allowed myself to believe it was his way of coming back to me. That first evening had been perfect on the surface. We ate dinner on a terrace overlooking the water, the air warm and soft, the lights reflecting like scattered gold across the marina. Ryan talked about his business, about expansion, about opportunities overseas, and I listened the way I always had, with pride and quiet attention. Vanessa chimed in occasionally, guiding the conversation, correcting small details, laughing at the right moments. I remember noticing how often she answered questions that were directed at him, how she kept track of the bill, the reservations, the timing of everything. At the time, I told myself it was just her personality, organized and efficient. The next morning, she offered to keep my passport in the hotel safe along with theirs, saying it would be safer that way, and I agreed without hesitation because I had no reason not to trust my own family. Later, Ryan asked if I could sign a few documents for him, something about a temporary authorization related to travel insurance and emergency contact forms, and I signed where he pointed without reading closely, because he was my son and because I had signed things for him my entire life without ever being misled. Sitting there in the lobby now, replaying those small moments, I could feel each one settling into place like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to see before. The way Vanessa had taken my purse earlier that morning, saying she would carry it while I tried on shoes at the boutique. The way Ryan had distracted me with a phone call just long enough for her to step away. The way neither of them had mentioned where my documents were when we returned to the hotel. None of it had felt urgent at the time. None of it had felt like danger. But sitting there with nothing in my hands and nowhere to go, I understood that trust, once given freely, can be used just as easily as it can be honored. I folded my hands in my lap and watched the people moving through the lobby, their lives continuing without interruption, and I realized that the version of this trip I had believed in had ended long before my key card turned red. It had ended the moment I chose not to question the small things, the quiet shifts, the subtle ways I was being guided instead of included. And now, whatever came next, I would have to face it without the illusion that I was still part of their world. I sat there longer than I expected, long enough for the initial shock to settle into something quieter, something sharper, like a thin layer of ice forming over deep water. I did not cry, not because I was not hurt, but because I had spent too many years learning how to carry pain without letting it spill over in front of others. Instead, I watched. That was something I had always been good at. Watching people when they thought no one was paying attention. Across the lobby, Ryan and Vanessa were still standing near the front desk, speaking with one of the staff members. Vanessa leaned slightly forward as she talked, her voice low but firm, the way she always spoke when she wanted something handled quickly. Ryan stood beside her, hands in his pockets, nodding occasionally, not once looking in my direction. It was not anger on his face. It was something colder than that. Indifference, as if I had already been removed from the equation in his mind. I looked away before they could turn and notice me, not because I was afraid, but because I understood something important in that moment. If they had gone this far, then whatever they were planning had already been decided long before today. I was not going to get answers by confronting them in the middle of a lobby. I needed to understand the full picture first. I reached for my purse again out of habit, even though I already knew it was empty, and that small, automatic gesture brought back another memory from earlier that morning. We had gone shopping in one of the luxury malls, the kind where everything gleamed and every store felt like its own private world. Vanessa had insisted I try on a pair of shoes, something she said would be perfect for dinner that night. I remember hesitating because of the price, but she laughed it off and said, "Do not worry, Evelyn, you deserve it." I had smiled, a little embarrassed, a little grateful, and handed her my purse so I could sit down and try them on. It seemed like such a small thing at the time, such a normal thing. Now, Sitting here, it felt like a turning point I had completely missed. I could see it clearly now, the way she had stepped aside for just a moment, the way Ryan had started asking me about my flight, distracting me with questions that did not matter. They had not needed to rush. They had not needed to hide. They had simply needed me to trust them, and I had done that without hesitation. I folded my hands again and let out a slow breath, careful to keep my expression neutral, because even now I could feel the eyes of others occasionally passing over me. Not with suspicion, but with that quiet curiosity people have when they sense something is slightly out of place. A well-dressed older woman sitting alone in a luxury hotel with no luggage, no drink, no companion. I wondered what story they would imagine if they stopped to think about it. Probably something simple. A delayed check-in. A husband running late. No one ever assumes the truth is something deliberate, something personal. That is what makes it so effective. I shifted slightly in my seat and glanced once more toward the front desk. Ryan and Vanessa were gone now. They had not come to me. They had not said a word. They had simply finished whatever needed to be done and left, as if I had already been taken care of. That thought should have hurt more than it did, but instead it brought a strange kind of clarity. For years, I had told myself that the distance between us was temporary, that life had simply gotten busy, that marriages change priorities. I had made excuses for missed calls, for short visits, for the way Vanessa always seemed to speak on his behalf. But sitting there now, with nothing but the clothes on my back and the quiet hum of a lobby that did not belong to me, I could finally see it for what it was. This was not distance. This was removal. Careful, planned, and complete. I straightened my shoulders slightly, not for anyone else, but for myself, because if there was one thing I refused to lose in that moment, it was the dignity I had carried through every difficult chapter of my life. I had raised a son from nothing. I had built a life with my own hands. And even now, sitting alone in a foreign country with no money and no documents, I knew that this story was not over. What I did not realize yet was that someone else had already decided the same thing. I remained seated for several more minutes, long enough for the rhythm of the lobby to return to normal around me, long enough for the moment to stop feeling like an interruption and start feeling like a new reality. People continued to arrive and leave, rolling their suitcases across the polished floors, speaking in low, confident voices, completely unaware that a life had just been quietly rearranged a few feet away from them. I adjusted my sleeve slightly, smoothing the fabric as if I were preparing for something formal, because in a way, I was. There is a certain kind of strength that does not announce itself, that does not demand attention, and I had relied on that kind of strength more times than I could count. As I sat there, I began to replay not just the past few days, but the past few years, tracing the slow shift in my relationship with Ryan that I had tried so hard to ignore. It had not happened all at once. It never does. It had started with small things, calls that became shorter, visits that became less frequent, conversations that felt more like obligations than connections. Then came the changes after he married Vanessa. At first, I told myself it was natural. New marriages come with adjustments, with priorities that shift and boundaries that form. I respected that. I stayed in my place. I did not interfere. But over time, I noticed how often he would defer to her, how decisions that once felt shared between us were now filtered through her approval. Even simple things, like where we would have dinner or when he could visit, seemed to require her agreement. I never confronted it. I believed that if I remained patient, if I showed understanding, things would balance themselves out. That is what I had always done. That is what I had always believed a mother should do. Now, sitting in that lobby with nothing but time and clarity, I could see how that patience had been mistaken for permission. Permission to distance. Permission to exclude. Permission to eventually remove me entirely. I let out a slow breath and glanced once more toward the entrance, half expecting to see them return, to hear Ryan call my name, to tell me there had been some misunderstanding. But the doors opened and closed without them, letting in strangers instead of answers. The truth settled deeper with each passing second. They were not coming back. Not for me. Not to explain. Not to apologize. Whatever they needed from me had already been taken. That thought should have broken something inside me. But instead it created a strange kind of calm. The kind that comes when you finally stop waiting for someone to do the right thing and accept that they will not. I shifted slightly in my chair and noticed a staff member glance in my direction, his expression polite but observant, as if he had been watching longer than I realized. He did not approach immediately. He simply stood at a distance, speaking briefly with another employee before looking back at me again. It was a small detail, but something about it felt different from the casual curiosity of other guests. There was intention in it. Recognition, almost. I looked away for a moment, unsure what to make of it, and focused instead on keeping my posture steady, my breathing even. I was not going to let myself appear lost, even if I was. That was when I heard footsteps approaching, measured and deliberate, stopping just a few feet from where I sat. I lifted my gaze slowly, expecting a routine question, perhaps an offer of assistance or a polite inquiry about my stay. Instead, I found myself looking at a man whose expression held none of the casual politeness I had grown used to in the past hour. His eyes were focused, searching, as if he were trying to confirm something he could not quite believe. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. The noise of the lobby seemed to fade slightly around that silence, leaving only the quiet space between recognition and realization. And then he asked a question that did not belong in that moment, not in that place, not in the life I thought I was living. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his voice respectful but certain, "did you once live in Boston many years ago?" For a moment, I did not answer him, not because I did not hear the question, but because it reached into a part of my life I had not thought about in years, a part that felt distant and almost unreal compared to where I was sitting now. Boston. The word lingered in my mind like an echo from another lifetime, back when everything had been simpler, when Ryan was still a boy and I was still building a future out of long shifts and quiet determination. I studied the man standing in front of me, taking in the details I had overlooked at first. He was well dressed, but not in the way that called attention to itself. His suit was tailored, understated. The kind of clothing that signaled authority without needing to prove it. His posture was straight, his expression composed, but there was something else in his eyes, something that did not belong to a casual hotel interaction. Recognition. Careful, deliberate recognition. I tilted my head slightly and answered, my voice calm, steady, the same voice I had used in far more uncertain situations than this. "Yes," I said, a long time ago. The moment the words left my mouth, something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A quiet confirmation, as if a question he had been holding on to had just been answered. He nodded once, more to himself than to me, then spoke again, his tone even more respectful now. "Would you mind if I asked your name, ma'am?" I hesitated for only a second, not out of fear, but out of habit. In the past hour, I had lost so much so quickly that even something as simple as giving my name felt like a small risk. But there was something about him that did not feel threatening. It felt intentional. "Evelyn," I said. "Evelyn Carter." He exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if he had been holding his breath for that exact answer. Then he straightened slightly and placed his hand over his chest in a gesture that felt both formal and sincere. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "please forgive me if I am mistaken, but did you ever volunteer at a community center in South Boston, teaching English classes many years ago?" The memory came back so suddenly that it caught me off guard. A small building with worn floors and folding chairs, a group of young students from different countries, all trying to find their footing in a place that did not yet feel like home. I had volunteered there for nearly 2 years while working part-time, helping anyone who walked through those doors with whatever I could offer. It had not felt like anything extraordinary at the time. It had just felt like the right thing to do. I looked at him more closely now, searching his face for something familiar, but I could not place him. "Yes," I said slowly, "I did. But that was a very long time ago." He nodded again, this time with a small, almost relieved smile. "I thought so," he said quietly. "You may not remember me. I was very young. My family had just arrived. I struggled with the language, with everything. You stayed after class one evening to help me read a letter. I still remember that." I blinked, trying to connect the man in front of me with the fragments of that memory, but time had changed too much. Faces blur over decades. Lives move on. What stays are moments, not identities. "I am sorry," I said gently. "I wish I could remember." He shook his head immediately, dismissing the apology with quiet certainty. "There is nothing to apologize for," he replied. "You helped more people than you could possibly remember. But I never forgot you." There was a pause then, a deeper silence that seemed to settle between us, filled not with uncertainty this time, but with something else entirely. Intention. He glanced briefly toward the front desk, then back at me, his expression sharpening slightly, as if he had just noticed something he did not like. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, lowering his voice just enough to make the moment feel private. "May I ask, why are you sitting here alone?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. I looked down at my empty hands for a brief second, then back up at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Because," I said calmly, "it seems I no longer have a room." He did not react the way most people would have. There was no confusion, no polite apology, no suggestion that I speak to someone else. Instead, his expression changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of shift you only notice if you have spent years reading people closely. His eyes hardened slightly, not toward me, but toward the situation itself, as if something about what I had just said did not align with what he believed should be true. "I see," he said quietly, but there was a weight behind those two words that made them feel anything but casual. He straightened fully now, his posture no longer that of a curious observer, but of someone stepping into a role he understood very well. "Please wait here, Mrs. Carter," he added, his tone respectful but firm, as if it was not a suggestion but a decision. "Already made." I nodded once, not because I understood what he intended to do, but because for the first time since my key card had failed, I felt something shift in the air around me, something that suggested I was no longer invisible in this place. He turned and walked toward the front desk with measured steps, each movement controlled, deliberate. I watched as he spoke to the staff member who had been assisting Ryan and Vanessa earlier. Their conversation was brief, but I could see the immediate change in posture from the employee, the way his shoulders straightened, the way his expression shifted from routine politeness to alert attention. Another staff member was called over, then another. Within seconds, a quiet ripple of awareness moved through that side of the lobby, subtle enough that most guests would not notice, but impossible to miss if you were looking for it. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, observing the scene unfold without drawing attention to myself. I had learned long ago that moments like this do not require interference. They require patience. A few minutes passed, though it felt longer, and then the man returned to me, his expression now composed in a different way, more certain, more resolved. "Mrs. Carter," he said, stopping just in front of me. "There has been a misunderstanding." I held his gaze, not challenging him, but not accepting the word either. "I do not believe it was a misunderstanding," I replied calmly. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging my response without arguing it. "Regardless," he said, choosing his words carefully, "it will be corrected." There was something in the way he said it that made the statement feel absolute, not hopeful, not conditional. Corrected, not discussed, not reviewed. Corrected. Before I could respond, he gestured subtly toward the seating area beside me, and within moments, another staff member approached carrying a tray with a glass of water and a neatly folded cloth napkin. The gesture was small, almost ordinary, but the intent behind it was not. It was not hospitality. It was respect. I accepted the water with a slight nod, my fingers steady as I held the glass, even though inside, I could feel the careful tension of the past hour beginning to loosen just slightly. Across the lobby, I noticed two uniformed employees moving quickly but discreetly toward the entrance, while another spoke into a small communication device clipped to his jacket. No one raised their voice. No one made a scene. But the atmosphere had changed. The same space that had felt indifferent just moments ago now felt attentive, aware, as if something important had been recognized and was being handled accordingly. I took a slow sip of water and set the glass down gently, keeping my movements measured, controlled. I had no desire to appear desperate, even if I had every reason to be. The man in front of me watched me for a moment, then spoke again, his voice lower now, more personal. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "the gentleman who you arrived with earlier today, your son, he has already left the property." I felt the words land, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something I had already accepted. I nodded once, my expression unchanged. "Yes," I said quietly. "I assumed as much." He studied my face carefully, perhaps expecting a different reaction, but when none came, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of his own. "There are a few matters we need to clarify," he continued. "Regarding your stay, your belongings, and your documents." He paused briefly, then added, "And I believe there is someone who would like to speak with you personally." I did not ask who. I did not need to. Something in the way he said it told me that whatever was about to happen next was not part of the plan Ryan and Vanessa had made. And for the first time since I had been locked out of that room, I allowed myself to feel something beyond control and composure. Not relief. Not yet. But the quiet beginning of it. He did not keep me waiting long, but he did not rush either. And that alone told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person who was about to enter my life in that moment. In places like this, power does not move quickly. It moves with certainty. I sat there, my hands resting lightly on my lap, watching the subtle shifts in the lobby as if I were observing a quiet performance that only a few people knew was taking place. Staff members moved with more purpose now, their voices lower, their attention sharper. The man who had first approached me stood a few feet away, speaking softly into a discreet device, his posture straight, his tone measured. Whatever he had set in motion, it was not small. A few minutes later, the atmosphere changed again, but this time it was different. It was not movement. It was presence. Conversations softened without anyone being told to lower their voices. Staff members instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path through the lobby without drawing attention to it. It was the kind of shift you feel before you fully see it, the kind that signals someone important has arrived. I lifted my gaze just as he entered, and even without knowing who he was, I understood immediately that he was not an ordinary guest. He did not need an introduction. His presence spoke for him. He walked with a quiet confidence, not looking around to assess the room, but moving as if the space already belonged to him. He was dressed simply, but every detail was precise, from the cut of his suit to the way he carried himself. There was no urgency in his steps, no need to impress. People like him do not perform authority. They embody it. As he approached, the man who had spoken to me earlier stepped forward and inclined his head slightly, speaking to him in a tone I could not fully hear, but I caught my name in the exchange. Evelyn Carter. The man's eyes shifted to me then, and for a brief second, the world around us seemed to narrow to that single moment of recognition. He studied my face, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that felt certain, as if he had already decided who I was before confirming it for himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, but there was a warmth beneath it that I had not expected. "Mrs. Carter," he said, and the way he said my name carried a weight that made it feel different from when others had used it that day. "It has been many years." I blinked, taken slightly off guard by the familiarity in his tone. I searched his face again, more carefully this time, trying to place him, but the years had changed too much. "I am sorry," I said honestly. "I do not believe I recognize you." He smiled faintly, not offended, not surprised. "I would not expect you to," he replied. "You met me when I had nothing. When I was just a boy trying to understand a language that was not my own." The memory from moments ago returned, sharper now, clearer. The community center. The young students. The long evenings spent helping strangers feel less lost in a place that did not yet feel like home. I felt something shift inside me, a connection forming between the past and the present that I had not anticipated. "You were one of the students?" I asked quietly. He inclined his head once. "Yes," he said. "And you stayed after class when you did not have to. You helped me read a letter from my father. You told me to take my time, that I did not have to rush to become someone else just to belong." His gaze did not leave mine as he spoke, and there was something deeply sincere in the way he recalled those words, as if they had stayed with him long after that moment had passed for me. I felt a quiet warmth rise in my chest, not pride exactly, but something close to it. "I remember the students," I said softly. "I just did not realize." I trailed off, not sure how to finish the thought. He nodded slightly, understanding what I meant without needing me to say it. "Life changes in ways we do not always expect," he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "My name is Omar." He did not need to say anything more. The name alone carried recognition, not from memory, but from the way everyone around us reacted to it, the way the staff stood just a little straighter, the way the space itself seemed to acknowledge him. I held his gaze, steady, composed, even as I understood that the man standing in front of me was no longer the boy from that classroom. "It is good to see you again, Omar," I said quietly. He studied me for a moment longer. Then his expression shifted, just slightly, as his attention moved from the past to the present. "I have been informed," he said carefully, "that you were denied access to your room, and that your personal belongings are missing." His tone remained calm, but there was something beneath it now, something firmer, something that suggested this was not a matter that would be overlooked. I did not need to explain. I simply nodded once. That was enough. He turned slightly toward the man beside him, speaking in a low voice that carried authority without volume. Instructions were given, decisions made, all within seconds. And just like that, the situation that had left me sitting alone and invisible less than an hour ago was no longer mine to solve. It belonged to someone else now. Someone who had not forgotten who I was, even when I had nearly forgotten it myself. What followed did not happen loudly, and that was what made it so powerful. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, no scene that would draw the attention of the guests moving through the lobby. Instead, everything unfolded with a quiet precision that felt almost effortless, as if the system around us had simply corrected itself the moment it recognized something was out of place. Omar spoke only a few words to the man beside him, and within seconds, several staff members moved into action. One approached the front desk terminal, another stepped away to make a call, and a third disappeared down a corridor with purposeful urgency. No one hesitated. No one questioned. I remained seated, observing, my hands still folded in my lap. But for the first time since I had been locked out of my room, I no longer felt like an outsider watching something I did not belong to. I felt acknowledged. Omar turned his attention back to me, his expression composed but attentive. "Your belongings will be located," he said calmly, "and your documents will be returned to you immediately." There was no uncertainty in his voice, no suggestion that this might take time or require negotiation. It was simply a matter of fact. I nodded once, accepting his words without needing reassurance, because something in the way he spoke made it clear that this was not a promise. It was a decision already set in motion. A few minutes later, one of the staff members returned, carrying a slim tablet. He spoke quietly to Omar, showing him something on the screen. I could not see the details, but I noticed the slight tightening of Omar's expression, not in anger, but in recognition of something he had already anticipated. He asked a brief question, received an answer, then nodded once. "Understood," he said. The staff member stepped back immediately. I watched as another employee approached with a small leather case, the kind used to carry important documents. He stopped just a few steps away and waited for Omar's acknowledgement before stepping forward and placing it carefully on the low table beside me. "Mrs. Carter," Omar said, gesturing gently toward it. "Please check that everything is intact." I reached for the case slowly, my movements deliberate, and opened it. Inside, I saw my passport, my identification, and the envelope of cash I had packed before leaving home. Everything was exactly where it should have been. I ran my fingers lightly over the contents, not because I needed to confirm they were real, but because I needed a moment to fully understand what it meant. Just an hour ago, these items had been taken from me without a word. Now, they had been returned without a struggle. Not because I had demanded them, but because someone else had decided they should never have been taken in the first place. I closed the case gently and looked up at Omar. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady, but carrying more meaning than the words alone could express. He inclined his head slightly, accepting my gratitude without making it seem like I owed him anything. "There is more," he said quietly. "The room that was assigned to you has been reviewed." He paused briefly, then added, "It will no longer be necessary for you to return there." I understood what he meant without needing further explanation. Whatever had been arranged by Ryan and Vanessa, whatever access they had used to control my stay, it had already been undone. Omar turned slightly toward the staff member beside him and spoke again, his tone low but unmistakably authoritative. "Prepare the suite," he said, "and ensure that Mrs. Carter has everything she requires." The man nodded immediately and stepped away, already issuing instructions into his device. I felt a shift inside me then, not overwhelming, not dramatic, but steady and undeniable. The balance had changed. The position I had been placed in, alone, uncertain, without resources, had been replaced by something entirely different. Not dependency, not obligation, but respect. I glanced around the lobby once more, noticing how the same space that had felt indifferent before now seemed to respond differently to my presence. Staff members acknowledged me with subtle nods. Their attention was no longer casual. It was intentional. I returned my gaze to Omar, who was watching me with a quiet understanding that required no explanation. "You should not have been treated this way," he said simply. There was no judgment in his tone, no anger directed at me, only a clear statement of what he believed to be true. I held his gaze for a moment, then replied with equal calm. "No," I said, "I should not have." And for the first time since everything had unfolded, I realized that the story I thought I was living had changed completely, not because I had fought for it, but because someone had remembered who I was when it mattered most. The transition from the lobby to the suite happened so smoothly that for a moment it felt unreal, as if I had stepped into a different version of the same day, without fully understanding how I had arrived there. One of the staff members guided me toward a private elevator, his tone respectful but unobtrusive, as though he understood that what I needed most was not attention, but space. Omar walked beside me, not ahead, not behind, but level, and that simple detail did not go unnoticed. It was not a gesture of control. It was a gesture of respect. When the elevator doors closed, the quiet inside felt different from the silence I had experienced earlier. This was not the silence of isolation. This was the silence of transition. I stood there, my reflection faint in the polished walls, holding the leather case that contained everything that had almost been taken from me, and I allowed myself, just for a second, to feel the weight of what had happened. Not the betrayal itself. That had already settled into something I understood, but the realization that I had nearly accepted it without question. The elevator opened onto a private floor, and we stepped into a space that was calm, understated, and impossibly refined. The suite was larger than my entire home back in Ohio, but it did not feel overwhelming. It felt intentional, every detail designed with care rather than excess. A staff member opened the door and stepped aside, allowing me to enter first. I paused just inside, taking in the quiet light, the clean lines, the absence of anything unnecessary. For a moment, I did not move. I simply stood there, letting the reality of the space settle around me. "This will be your room," Omar said calmly, his voice carrying no expectation, no insistence, only assurance. I turned slightly toward him, my expression steady. "You have already done more than enough," I said. He shook his head gently, dismissing the idea without hesitation. "No," he replied, "this is not about doing more. This is about doing what should have been done from the beginning." There was a pause then, not uncomfortable, but reflective. I walked a few steps into the room, setting the leather case down on a small table near the window. The city stretched out below once again, but from this height, it looked different. Not distant, not unreachable, just there. I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the table and looked out for a moment before speaking. "You remembered something I had forgotten," I said quietly. Omar did not respond immediately. When I turned back toward him, his expression was thoughtful, measured. "You did not forget," he said. "You simply did not realize how far it had carried." I considered his words, letting them settle in the same way everything else had been settling since this morning. For years, I had believed that the value of what I had done in my life was tied to what I could still offer, to how useful I remained to the people around me. I had measured my place in my son's life by how often he called, how much he needed me, how present I could be without becoming a burden. And when that place began to disappear, I had accepted it quietly, assuming that time had simply moved on without me. But standing there now, in a place I had never imagined I would be, with someone who had remembered a single act of kindness from decades ago, as if it had just happened, I understood something I had not allowed myself to see before. Value does not disappear just because it is no longer acknowledged by the people closest to you. It simply waits to be recognized elsewhere. I turned back to Omar, meeting his gaze with a calm that felt different from anything I had carried earlier that day. "I appreciate what you have done," I said, "but I will not stay here as someone who needs to be rescued." He nodded once, not offended, not surprised. "I would not expect you to," he replied. "You are here because you are respected, not because you are in need." That distinction mattered more than anything else he could have said. I inclined my head slightly in acknowledgement, then glanced once more at the city beyond the window. Somewhere out there, Ryan and Vanessa were continuing their day, believing their plan had been completed, believing they had removed me from their lives without consequence. I did not feel anger toward them. Not anymore. What I felt was clarity. They had shown me exactly who they were. And in doing so, they had given me something I had been missing for a long time. Freedom. I turned back toward the room, toward the quiet space that now belonged to me, and took a slow, steady breath. This story had not ended the way they expected. And for the first time in years, neither had I.